Nikki mentioned something honest before debut. Before we debuted, I spent all my time alone. I got through the loneliness by looking at pictures of my family. He was 14 years old, separated from his family in a foreign country, where his idea of home was just photos on his phone. 7 teenagers made permanent decisions before they understood permanence. This is what they gave up, and what they never got back. For quite a lot of them, they began trading their lifestyles long before they were introduced on Island. When Nikki was young, he went to Tokyo Dome to see SHINee perform. He was inspired and felt determined to become an artist just like them someday. That was the thing he kept chasing when he moved to South Korea from Japan during his second year of middle school. After moving, he went to school maybe once every 3 months. He says it didn't even feel like he was going to school for real. He rarely went to school because he wasn't truly there for standard education. He was there to train. However, this meant he had to pick one or the other. Every hour in a practice room was an hour not sitting in a classroom, and when you're chasing something as specific as being an idol, school starts to feel like the thing getting in the way rather than the thing you feel like you need to be doing. Most kids his age weren't going to school because they loved it. They went because that's just what you do at 13. They complain about it, eagerly wait for the next day, and wishing they could be literally anywhere else, yet at the same time, they're forming bonds with their classmates. Some bonds that'll last them tens of years. But Nikki wasn't there for any of that. Not the boring parts and not the good parts. He was off somewhere else, separated from it all, and trading it, believing he could make it as an idol. At this point, he didn't even know if he'd make it to debut. I questioned whether I could do well on my own when I left Japan. At 13 years old, he was unknowingly selling his education away for a dream he wasn't even sure he could achieve. And the deeper he got into it, the less it felt like he could turn around. If you want to see more videos about ENHYPEN, make sure to subscribe. I strive to make positive content about them, so you don't want to miss it. Now back to ENHYPEN's childhood. Years after they debuted, Jungwon acknowledged how strange their early years were. It's unusual for people to start working when they're as young as we are. He was 18 when he said that. However, it's believed he began training at SM Entertainment when he was just 13 years old, which means by the time most kids were still working through middle school, Jungwon was already getting deep inside a system that's designed to push him to his limits and turn him into a professional performer. And while that was happening, he attempted to keep up his academic life. When I was in middle school, I would often leave school early. I couldn't even go on school trips. He says that was the saddest part of it all. It wasn't so much the pressure or the long hours he needed to put in, but the things he missed out on by choosing this path. For a lot of students, these types of trips are the things they remember the most, the thing they look back on. But Jungwon didn't have that. He never went. He kept training for his dream because that was what mattered most to him. And with every year he gave to it, going back to anything else seemed less and less possible. On average, only 0.1% of the people who audition for big hit entertainment actually get in. And of those trainees, only 10% actually debut. Jake made a similar trade to Nikki at just 17. He left Australia on his own to train in Korea. He described the life he left behind there as the definition of a chill life. He would get off school at 3, he had open afternoons, there was nothing pulling him anywhere in particular. Honestly, that kind of life is really easy to underestimate when you're inside of it. You don't think about it as something worth protecting because it doesn't feel like anything at all. It's just any other day that you've gotten used to. Maybe you even think it's boring. It's just time that exists without a purpose attached to it. Jake gave that up entirely. It was by no means an easy decision, but the reason he gave was kinda straightforward. There's nothing I wanted more than to become an idol. Ever since I started dreaming of it, my goal was to debut no matter what. When I get hooked on something, I have to see it through to the end. I think about it all day and become obsessive. So he moved to another country on his own. He left his family and friends behind. He left everything and bet his future on something that hadn't happened yet and might never happen at all. The only assurance he had was that he'd passed an audition. Sunghoon understood that feeling, but for him, the trade had started long before he was even training to be an idol. He began training as a figure skater when he was only 9, where he not only competed, but also trained alongside skaters who would go on to represent South Korea at the Olympics. That's how high of a level he was already at with training. His school years were already structured around those trainings, competitions, and early mornings that had nothing to do with being a normal kid. And when BTS released Love Yourself and the track Idol came out, he said that was the moment he made up his mind. He chose to pursue idol life instead, which means he wasn't just walking away from a normal teenage experience. He was walking away from an Olympic experience, something he'd always dreamed of being a part of. Because of that, he had a hard time giving it up, especially after how much time he'd put into figure skating. I couldn't have a normal school life like other kids because I was already figure skating. I regret that I don't have those memories. That word regret is very interesting. He's not saying that all of it was hard for him or that he wishes it was easier. He's saying that he's jealous of all the memories kids his age have been able to make. All the school trips, the after-school chaos with friends, the completely ordinary moments that most people don't think twice about. Sunghoon doesn't have them at all, and at some point he became aware of that gap in his childhood. He became old enough to understand what a normal school life was supposed to look like. However, at that point, it was far too late to go back and try again. None of them fully understood what they were trading away when they did. That's just what happens when you make permanent decisions before you're old enough to understand what permanent truly means. Jay trained for nearly 3 years before ENHYPEN ever existed. Years of early mornings, late nights, and days that honestly all felt similar. However, the person next to him through most all of it wasn't his parents or his friends from back home. It was Heeseung, another teenager who'd given up similar things to be training in the same place. Jay acknowledges it, telling us this: "I spent more time with Heeseung than with my mom." Most teenagers grow up inside of their family first, slowly becoming more independent from them over time. But Jay was somewhere else during those years, and the person who filled that space wasn't someone he chose in the same way you'd choose a friend. It was just whoever was there, whoever shared his dreams, his goals, but most importantly, his decisions. Heeseung was in that same position, but his experience of those early trainee days looked slightly different from everyone else's. He said he dreamed of becoming a singer since he was 6 or 7 years old, but that he totally lacked confidence. That gap between their dream and the belief that he could actually do it followed him all the way into the practice room. When he first started training at Big Hit, he was, as he put it, absolutely hopeless. He couldn't do basic moves. He was bad enough that his friends back home joked about it, wondering how he'd even been cast in the first place. While his friends were back home living whatever normal life looked like for them, Heeseung was in a practice room doing the same basic movements over and over again, feeling like he wasn't getting where he needed to be. He'd given up the life his friends were living for something he wasn't even sure he could do yet. That kind of doubt doesn't really disappear very easily. It's something that just weakens ever so slowly as you consistently show up to practice. This was the reality of what chasing that dream actually looked like day to day. A practice room with mirrored walls, the same floor they danced on hundreds of times, performing the same routines in the reflection. That was the world they lived in. Jay sometimes felt like he needed to narrow in on practice exclusively. He'd dedicate all the time he had available to practicing, with the exception of eating, sleeping, and showering. Given that Sunghoon wasn't continuing to pursue figure skating, he was practically living a double life during this period. His days were split in two, going to the rink in the morning and then company practice rooms at night. It was just one demanding environment onto the next. For Sunoo, the day looked different. He wasn't living in a dorm with the others. He was going back and forth between the practice studio and home, alone, every single day. He said it was the first time he'd ever done anything by himself, and it wasn't a trip to somewhere new, or some grand teenage moment of independence. It was just a commute between two places he had to be. But despite what you'd think, not every day had lessons. This meant there wasn't a schedule telling them where to be or what to work on. Jake described those days as being difficult. It was okay on the days when I had lessons, but when I didn't know what I should be doing all day long. Most people imagine trainee life as being repeated lessons, but some days that structure vanishes and you're kinda left wondering how you can improve that day on your own. Nicky tried to practice until whatever he was working on was perfect, then waited for the next class and repeated that cycle. He made sure to do this every single day, because at this point, he felt he wasn't good enough, and every day he showed up was another day that made going home feel less justifiable. That feeling's honestly pretty understandable when you consider all that he's done to be there. He was feeling the gap between where he was currently and where he believed he needed to be. On Jake's 18th birthday, he was all alone in the practice studio. It was November 15th, 15 days before ENHYPEN would debut. It was just him in the mirrors, drilling the same choreography he'd been working on for weeks. While he practiced, his family was back in Australia. The friends he grew up with were living out whatever their usual Sunday looked like. They weren't celebrating it with Jake, because months before, he'd made a decision that put a whole ocean between him and his past life. Nothing connected him to the people he used to live so closely to, except his phone. I was all alone in the practice studio on my last birthday, calling and texting my family. Your 18th birthday is supposed to mark something. It's the last day of being a kid, and the first day of something new. For most people, you're surrounded by the people who watched you get there. Though for Jake, he was surrounded by the choice he made, the choice to leave what's comfortable in hopes of something more. And even on that last day, he wasn't done trading his life. The K-pop industry isn't just looking for people who can sing and dance. Those things matter, obviously, but there are a lot of people who can sing and dance. What's harder to find, and what the companies are genuinely trying to identify, is someone who will restructure their entire life around this very thing, and continue to do it until they reach their dream. The training system is designed to tear you apart. It's meant to filter out the people who wouldn't be able to handle debuting, not because they aren't skillful, but because living as an idol is difficult. The training hours aren't just long because that's how long it takes to learn choreography. They're drawn out to see what you'll give up to prioritize them. Heeseung, Jae, and Nikki, they'd already proven it, and Big Hit absolutely noticed, because they're exactly the kind of person they're looking for the most. If you'll go that far just to train without any guarantee of success, you're all the more likely to cut out whatever the industry needs you to cut out once you actually do debut. Island was where Big Hit got to especially put them to the test. For nearly 4 months, they lived inside a facility with cameras watching every movement they made, every conversation they had, and every impulsive decision they took. By choosing to participate in Island, they were declaring their ambitions to the world. Nikki and Jake were already separated from their families, but now everyone needed to try that cold reality. They absolutely were allowed to take breaks, but everyone knew the risks that came with choosing that over relentless practice. The current members of ENHYPEN understood that especially well. Every choice they made came with both positives and negatives. They've made enough choices by now to understand each choice they make comes with consequences, even if it's just taking a 15-minute break. That extended to the nights too. They usually finished practice at 2 a.m., took their microphones off, and were exhausted. But yet, none of them could sleep. The producers would always tell them to go to bed. They had to be up at 10 a.m., but they'd still be talking until 6 a.m. because the anxiety of what they were going through was overwhelming them. It wasn't a bad decision exactly. Talking with each other was one of the things keeping them together. However, every hour they spent relieving stress was an hour of rest they weren't getting before another day of relentless practice. Mind you, they still don't even know for sure whether or not their time on Island would lead them to debut. And for Sunoo, that idea of debuting fell further and further from his mind as Island progressed. His parents didn't want him to go all in on becoming a celebrity in the first place. And yet, here he was, doing exactly that under cameras and being evaluated by the world. Originally, he was voted into the Island, but then he was voted out almost immediately. He worked hard and came back, only to be eliminated yet again. Every time the process told him he wasn't enough, he had to convince himself it was still worth it to continue. His mental state took a huge hit during this period. Sunoo had only been a trainee for about 10 months when Island began, which meant he had far less training experience than a lot of the other contestants did. Later on, he admitted that the early months of training had been extremely difficult for him, both physically and mentally. When I first started practicing, I would often hear people say that I'm not good because it hadn't been that long since I became a trainee. I wasn't feeling well at the time too, but I didn't want to give up, and I was quite depressed. He was a 17-year-old being evaluated on a TV show, receiving feedback that cut deep enough into him that it honestly left a permanent mark. And at one point during that same period, he became physically sick. He was forced to make another choice that very well could affect his trajectory as an idol. He could either stop, rest, and recover, and let someone else represent the ground, or he could go out anyway and try to prove himself to the producers and global viewers. He said he kept thinking about why he decided to do this in the first place. When he was a kid, he'd watch music shows, and the feeling he got watching it was the thing keeping him going. And now, he wanted to prove himself to the people who doubted him and thought he wasn't any good. Nobody was forcing him to go out there, but stopping meant acknowledging that everything he'd already given up would have been in vain. And so, he walked out to the island stage. I've already come this far, so how can I give up? If I become weak, everything I've done would become a waste of time. I didn't know what I would do if I didn't do this. While Sunoo had only been a trainee for 10 months, he wasn't sure what else he'd do if he failed to debut. Most of ENHYPEN shared this plan, or really, the lack of a plan. They were all in, putting not only their earlier comfortable lives on the line, but also giving up future opportunities they'd be missing out on. By pushing to be an idol, they threw out whatever chance they had at getting a head start in something else, something with a higher chance of success. Truthfully, at this point as trainees, they were motivated by fear. If I don't push harder, I'll lose. If Island doesn't work, what do I do next? What if I fail that too? If I can't make any of this work, everything that I've done up until now, will it all be for nothing? So many thoughts and worries were rushing through not only Sunoo's mind, but the minds of everyone there. All of ENHYPEN had sacrificed alternative paths for the sake of being an idol. Sunoo continued to perform because somewhere along the way, this path as an idol became the only one he could picture. Going back to a normal life, stepping away from the thing he'd given everything to, that no longer felt like an option. So he kept going, despite being sick, despite being depressed, despite not knowing if any of it would give him the result he wanted so desperately. None of them knew. That's the part that's easy to forget when you're watching from the outside. They had given up the kind of things you'll never get back. Their years as children that people often tell you to cherish, their relationships, the ordinary days other people were living out, and they had done all of it without any certainty it would work. Nobody promised them it would. They just kept going anyway. ENHYPEN understood they only get one chance at this. Some of them are so young that they might not even fully grasp that concept yet, but it's that willingness to take the chance they've been given and chase it without any certainty that got them through. And then, on November 30th, 2020, ENHYPEN debuted. Not because they practiced for however many hours every day, but because they sacrificed the things closest to them for the sake of extending that time. It's those types of people the K-pop industry is looking for, and ENHYPEN proved they were exactly that. They proved they had what it takes to take it on. But the things they gave up to get there didn't suddenly come back. Sunghoon had been giving things up since he was 9 years old. I regret that I don't have those memories, but I don't think there's anything I can do about it. There's no happy resolution for what they sacrificed. Their past decisions shaped where they are now, and they'll have to keep making more of them to stay there. But they understand that, and they keep choosing the thing they've dreamed about anyways. If you want to see how the lives of ENHYPEN went on to be the same as vampires after they debuted, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.